While I consider myself a proponent of density, most cities really wear me down. That's because many cities lack sufficient urban green space. Istanbul, a city of almost 15 million people, has 2% green space. Other cities might surprise you. Paris, which we typically think of as park-centric, is just 10% green space. Those low percentages pale in comparison to super green cities such as Zurich, Helsinki, Oslo, Vienna, Sydney, Shenzhen, Singapore, and Hong Kong, which are all above 40% green space. Density does not need to be sacrificed for green space. Lack of green space is just poor urban planning. Since green space is actually a huge topic, I'm going to narrow the focus of this video to my current hometown of Boulder, Colorado. As a college town of roughly 100,000 people, Boulder features 45,000 acres of green space and 148 miles of trails. While the average American city of around 200,000 has something like 40 acres per 1,000 residents, Boulder offers a luxurious 450 acres per 1,000 residents. But what does urban green space even mean? Families with young children might think of green space as a neighborhood playground, while outdoor enthusiasts might conceive of green space as an urban forest. At its heart, green space is the land that is public, vegetated, and urban. Suburbs, take note. While technically green, green space is not a lawn, and it is certainly not a golf course. In other words, privately owned vegetation is not green space. One of my favorite tools for evaluating urban green space is AllTrails, and this is not a sponsorship. That's because while I support playgrounds and small parks, especially as a new parent, I find these types of green space to be the bare minimum for an urban environment. A town that truly supports green space has enough to meet a variety of recreation needs, including an urban trail network. If you turn on AllTrails heat map feature, you can instantly get a feel for how much green space is available within a city. I lived in Seattle, and on the heat map, you can see that Discovery Park, the Arboretum, and some shorelines were the main areas for recreation. Due to these limited options, I regularly drove to Issaquah or North Bend on the weekends, which was pretty miserable given the traffic. In contrast, let's look at Boulder's heat map. You can see just how vast the trail network is relative to its size and how it kind of wraps around the town. Boulder's green space completely transforms your lifestyle. Hiking and enjoying the outdoors is no longer isolated to the occasional weekend trip. You can literally bike into the mountains before work or trail run on your lunch break. Boulder's green space is the reason so many outdoor enthusiasts choose to live here. You don't have to endure long commutes just to reconnect with nature. Today, Boulder is regarded as a pioneer in the conservation of green space, but in the decades following 1940, Boulder was all sprawl and no density. Rather than double down on density of the urban core, outlying cattle ranches were sold off to developers who turned them into car-oriented subdivisions. Other developers planned subdivisions in the foothills surrounding Boulder. Subdividing the mountains into large acre plots would mean huge losses in Boulder's primary asset, mountain access. Thousands of acres were being sold off to be enjoyed by a small group of residents. The new homes lacked walkability, transit, and were subject to wildfires, which ripped through the communities every few years. Further, the city would need to spend millions extending its water systems into the mountains. In watching the spread of homes into the foothills, a coalition called PLAN campaigned to ban the extension of water to properties above a specific elevation, known as the Blue Line. And while the Blue Line made development of mountainous subdivisions more costly for developers, it didn't prevent them outright. Boulder would have to buy these lands to protect them in the long run. In 1967, less than a decade after the Blue Line, PLAN achieved the impossible and helped pass the first sales tax in the United States dedicated to the acquisition of open space. Though the tax was just 0.4 cents of a sale, literally fractions of a penny, it generated funds needed for massive land acquisitions and the creation of Boulder's Greenbelt.
So I'm talking about fractions of a penny here, and over time, they add up to a lot.
Oh, okay.
By 1980, Boulder had acquired over 35,000 acres and spent $53 million on open space acquisitions. Not only would open space preserve the beauty of Boulder, it would help contain sprawl and ensure access to green space for nearly every neighborhood. It also helped organize a county-wide effort to acquire open space in the neighboring towns. So what can we learn from Boulder? First, let me say this town is not perfect. It's still very car-centric. I mean, it has at least 3 highways running directly through it, even if they do have bike lanes. However, Boulder has done a much better job than most American cities at combating sprawl and preserving green space. Here are the takeaways for a town looking to increase its green space. Cities need a sales tax to secure dedicated funds for the acquisition of green space. Cities need a master plan for the acquisition of green space, and that plan should ideally work towards a green belt, network of greenways, and removal of as much asphalt as possible. Cities need to be stringent with developers and mandate offsets are actual green space and not concrete plazas and rec centers. Finally, citizens need to campaign for green space. Without pushback, city council and developers will opt for profits over conservation. Green space is not a luxury, it's a basic need. So let's not just leave it for those wealthy enough to buy beachfront property or a home in the foothills. Americans seeking green space shouldn't be forced to drive hours to the nearest trailhead. Every city, from a small town to a metropolis, should have enough green space to support an urban trail network. To quote poet Gary Snyder, nature is not a place to visit, it's home.